Dear all, welcome to the next session of Turgev Talks. Today we are honored to be welcoming Ibtisam Ahmed, who will be giving a talk about COVID-19 catalyst to war. And really interesting approach and informative, I can see after I read her paper. But before we start, I would like to introduce her to you. Professor, welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much.
I will just give a brief introduction of your work, and then the floor will be yours. So, dear friend, Ibtisam Ahmed has a Bachelor of Law from the University of Cape Town and a Master of Law from Cornell University, where she also worked as a researcher. She's an attorney of Newark Bar and has lectured at universities and institutions of higher learning in South Africa. At present, Ibtisam is an independent researcher and consultant as well as managing editor of Hikayat. Hikayat is an online platform and which she co-founded, which showcases work of Muslims from around the world. Thank you very much once again and welcome. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be with Turgev Talks. So what I'm going to be talking about today is plague in history and what we can really learn from it in our sort of quasi-plague of COVID-19. So really back in March, I started thinking about plague and in particular, the way plague has been received or perceived rather in literary sources throughout history. But at the same time, and remember this is kind of back in March, one of the things that became quite clear was that many world leaders was starting to invoke the rhetoric of war. So we had President Donald Trump say, he referred to himself as a wartime president. Prime Minister Boris Johnson said that his government would act like any wartime government. President Emmanuel Macron said, we are at war. But now not only was the rhetoric being used, what we also started seeing, and many of us are still living through that right now, is that there began to be legislative measures that were taken, which look very similar to measures that are actually taken in times of war. Regulations that under normal circumstances would be questioned, their legality would be questioned. We're living with curfews, severe restrictions on our movement, and many people are living in states that are currently under a national state of disaster. So these measures start looking a lot like war. But as I started looking at other various sources, and particularly ancient ones, I began to see that this idea of being at war with an invisible enemy, so to speak, some kind of virus or disease, was really not anything new. It's a very, very old and ancient idea. And ancient writers really were making connections between war and plague right from the start of the Western literary tradition. So beginning with Homer in the Iliad. So this evening, I'm going to be discussing the metaphorical and real links between war and plague as it's been perceived by ancient writers, so that we can maybe use some of their insights and their tools of analysis to look at our situation and think about how we will be moving forward in COVID-19. I just want to say as a side note, I'm not sure that any of the ancient writers would consider COVID-19 a plague necessarily. As we know, we have a recovery rate, we have survival rates, and, there's some people who contract this virus and, don't show any symptoms at all. So be that as it may, what I'm also quite interested to show and to present to you all is how ancient writers were not just concerned with how plague affected the political realm, they were also very concerned with the effects that it had on the social behavior of human beings and what was going on with people's psychology and the psyche. And a very early example of this is found in the writings of Thucydides, who is, of course, the great Greek historian, who's also known for examining and developing a mode of looking at human behavior and human development and human nature in times of crises like war and plague. So he writes of a disease that erupts in Athens, and this is at the same time there is a war going on, and he says the following, and I'll just read it. He says, "By far the most terrible feature in the malady was the dejection which ensued when anyone felt himself sickening, for the despair into which they instantly fell took away their power of resistance and left them a much easier prey to the disorder. So here we see a very clear line that what the historian is describing to us is that as soon as people got into contact with this particular disease, there's this despair that accompanies the infection. There's a complete despair, and suddenly it takes away your power to resist, your power to be involved in sort of any kind of political discourse or political result. And this means that once that power is taken away, the people then they are more susceptible to the chaos that's ensuing around them. And then he continues and he says, but now when you have the state of despair, plus the lack of will to resist, and you couple that with being in social isolation, what then happens is that people fall into, as he describes, a lawless extravagance which owed its origin to the plague. So very quickly, people begin indulging in very hedonistic behavior. They begin indulging in kinds of behavior and things and activities that were denied to them in the previous order before this plague had happened. And Thucydides continues and he says that what happens is that fear of gods or law of man, there was none to restrain them. So again, there's no moral code, again, maybe linked to the religion of the time. There's no, even the law of the land is not being respected. Nothing is restraining people. So that's a very interesting trajectory in terms of the psychology of what can accompany plague and war when they are joined together. And so now we'll move to the sort of fast forward through history and move to the late Roman Republic, where we see historians there are also writing about the link between plague and war, and in this time quite metaphorically. So in discussing civil discord or civil strife, Cicero actually describes it as the great disease of the Republic, right? So we're beginning to see that disease is a way of describing things where there's a real strife in the society. There's a breakdown of the political order. Civil strife in particular is the language of plague is then invoked. Another Roman historian, Livy, describes, and he says there was an outbreak of pestilence which, however, created more alarm than mortality. And this is something we know all too well, that fear and panic are something that accompanies plague and disease and viruses, absolutely. We know that it also goes in phases. There may have been a lot of panic and sort of hysteria at the beginning. Maybe that dies down. Maybe infection rates rise again, and people are still maybe then not taking it too seriously. So we see that all these different dynamics are at play, and a lot of our reactions and our responses are informed by certain fears and certain hypes. And I think obviously in the modern age, what we're contending with that no one previous to us is contended with is social media and the constant hype that is around any news topic, any event, any situation. So that's something that we obviously experience that's quite unique to us. Now, one of the things that sort of contemporary historians have also highlighted is that epidemics and pandemics, what they do is they actually quite sharply contrast private interests and public interests and the difficulty of balancing the two. They also, and this is something that a contemporary historian named Patrick Wilson talks about, he says it interrogates the individual's moral duties towards his or her community. And this is something, again, that I think is very relatable to us when we reflect on our time in this quasi-plague. And to this end, the Roman historian Livy, he comments and he says that once this plague, hits the city or this area, he says that the thoughts of men were diverted from the political struggles of the forum to their homes. So in other words, people, again, really lose their appetite for political discourse, for what's going on in politics, for, looking at what's happening in the rest of society. They really do go back into their homes. And we can contrast that with Thucydides saying that people lose their power to resist, and there's no interest in what's going on in politics. This is creating a very specific type of human being, and it really does condition us to a certain status quo, which is not particularly healthy when all we've done is turn inward into our homes. And then this is the sort of the second part that a lot of the ancient writers really focus on, is this idea that once you're in the home, there is this huge strain on the life of the family and on family relationships. That plagues really do overemphasize the sort of difficulty balancing family relationships, that things become strained and tense. The sort of quite simple example that we're dealing with right now is, for example, you have families and you have some siblings, and there's a fight over, do we see the grandparents or not? Is it safe to visit the grandparents or not? Of course, the elderly are at a higher risk, and then you have someone say, no, but it's good for them to see the grandchildren. And there can be all these strains that are going on, or someone decides, they're going to do a small wedding. Who gets invited, who gets not invited? These are all, and we can sort of smile about it, but they are very real things and real difficulties that we're having to face now. That puts an extra strain on our relationships. It's a very real strain, and it happens within our families, and then within our communities. It sort of spreads out. So this is an added tension to all of this. And so from all of this, and from the language that's used by these particular ancient writers, and I focused on historians for this first part, we learn that there is a real and a metaphorical link between plague and war. And the crisis of plague mirrors the crisis of a breakdown in a socio-political order. Furthermore, there exists this idea that the dissolution of the physical body, right, being diseased and being ill, physical body, is linked to the collapse of the body politic. And this is something that has been reflected in throughout the ancient accounts, that once the physical body is in a state of decline, it's rotting, the political order is also rotting away and slowly collapsing. So that's a metaphor that we see being sort of repeated time and time again. And to this end, I would sort of hone in on using this metaphor by examining the works of 3 Roman poets. And so what I'll do is I'll basically recount in some brief detail their versions of plague, their accounts of plague narratives. So of course these are poets, so it's very imaginative. It's the language is very detailed, and because we're talking about plague and war, it's often very gory. Lots of rotting corpses in the streets and all of that. But the reason why it's important, or why I think it's helpful for us to look at them, is because they are obviously looking at plague as a metaphor for civil war. So yes, there's a link between plague and war in general, but of course between plague and civil war in particular. And these 3 writers all come out with a very distinct solution and conclusion to their plague narrative. So the 3 poets that we'll be looking at are Lucretius, then Virgil, and then Ovid. And I think it's really it's been great researching these 3 different perspectives on plague and potential outcomes. So we'll begin with Lucretius, and his plague narrative is based on a historical one, the one in Athens, and he essentially concludes that nature can destroy us at random. That's kind of his conclusion. It's everybody in the city at the end is annihilated, and that's the end. It's a very fatalistic, it's very bleak. The conclusion is really about the inevitability of death, and it's essentially an annihilation of an entire city, an entire population. And then we move to the second poet, Virgil, whose account is very different to the first one. So first of all, the first difference is that he doesn't base his plague on anything historical. His is purely his imagination. He comes up with an account that exists in a time period that we don't know, in a place that we don't know. It's somewhere in the Alps. And he really goes on an adventure in the sort of, imaginative experimentation of a writer. So he describes a plague that the first outbreak is amongst livestock, right? And it slowly starts moving to all the other species of animals. So what happens is that the humans, the people in this town, begin seeing slowly different types of animals succumb to this plague in a very quite violent manner and die. And there's a very gory description of animals dying, but also of them self-mutilating, which is a very, very vivid descriptions of this. And what this poet does is that he blurs the lines between the humans and animals, because in describing animals, he uses very human language. And I'll use one example. He says, he describes some cattle, some bulls. He describes the separation of the grieving bull from his dying brother. And in the Latin, this is very human language to describe these animals. And it really does expose the breakdown of brotherhood that's inherent in civil strife and in civil war. The idea of obviously brother against brother is a sort of archetype of civil war going across many different traditions, and Virgil does emphasize this quite significantly. So after a lot of death and destruction, because the plague now, of course, spreads to the humans, they're wearing animal skins, and therefore they too get infected. Virgil doesn't follow the pattern of Lucretius that everybody dies and that's the end. So he comes up with a different solution. His solution is that he introduces this particular character named Aristeas, and Aristeas rediscovers a kind of ancient mythical sort of religious practice through which one, slaughters an animal, sort of sacrificial animal, and from the corpse of that animal, bees are resurrected, sort of quite spontaneously or by magic or by some kind of miracle. Bees are come out of this corpse of an animal. And what then happens is this is the sort of rebirth of society. So in his account, you have a figure, Aristeas, who is now in charge of this beehive. And the fact that he uses bees is significant because, ancient readers at the time would always sort of look to conflicts that were happening within the Roman setting and sort of project that onto a kind of beehive situation. Now, interestingly enough, it's very clear that this character of Aristeas is a projection of Augustus, who was the ruler in Rome at the time, really quasi-monarch, although he doesn't call himself a king. And he's really the figure that's pivotal in the changeover from, sort of republic into empire. So he's interesting for a number of reasons. And here's this figure, as if the poet is basically saying, in the midst of plague and chaos and civil discord, what you need is a kind of benevolent dictator. You need someone who's going to put everybody into order, just like the bees, who are aggregated, who are uniform, who are solely focused on producing honey for the hive. And there's this collective, and there's no individuality, there's no identity, there's no questioning. It's just the following of the orders of the sort of beekeeper as manager. And that's a very clear sort of example of one potential solution to the kind of plague or social upheaval, that comes with a plague and with war. And then we move on to the third poet, Ovid, whose work is a sort of mythical, historical account of the world, and he sets his particular plague narrative on an island. And this island, Aegina, is named after one of the lovers of Zeus. So this is very much into the Greek mythology. And Zeus's mistress and him have a child, a king named Iacchus, who rules over this island. And of course, as is typical in Greek mythology, there is a jealous wife somewhere who then sends a plague to destroy this island. And that's really the setup of the plague. So again, not based on anything historical, it's imaginative. And Ovid really delights in the aesthetic of the grotesque. So it's even more gory, it's even more descriptive, plenty of rotting corpses lying in the streets and animals rotting and all of these things. But Ovid's account is interesting for a number of reasons. And the first is that initially the inhabitants of this island actually try and fight the plague, using medicine, using their rational faculties, trying to come together to fight this thing. Unfortunately for them, the devastation is so extreme that they're unable to, and their efforts are really cancelled out. The human beings that are suffering from the plague, because both animals and humans are affected, they begin to have excruciating pain, fever. One of the lines I'll just read that Ovid writes, he says, "Fever made the tongue rough and swollen. The mouth becomes dry, lay open to the warm, disease-laden winds as victims gasped for breath." So, very, very descriptive. And the fact that these inhabitants fail to find a cure, and the fact that there is so much despair, there's a paralysis of fear that it sets in. Fear sets in, paralyzes all the people, to the point that some people begin hanging themselves in front of the sacred altars. So sort of their places of religious worship, people are going there now and actually killing themselves. And Ovid writes, he says, some cut off their breath with a noose and banished by death their fear of death, summoning their approaching fate from the beyond. It's a very profound line that one sort of, he describes these people as banishing by death their fear of death. And if there's one thing that COVID-19 has absolutely highlighted for us is our fear of death. While death anxiety is it's a feature of the human condition, it's something it's a specter that hangs over every human being, and it certainly has from the beginning of time, and it will until the end of time. In the modern age, we seem to be very much in denial of the fact that death is a reality. And I think we see this more and more with the sort of obsession with youth, and being young and denying even the aging process. I mean, on one level, it's pure vanity, but on another, I think it is very much a denial of, accepting that the body is aging, that we are getting old, that we will be dying soon. So this is, really the inevitability of death, and this fear of death is something that has really, discussions around this have been brought to the fore, in this time of COVID-19. So back to the island, back to Ovid's island. In the midst of this devastation, King Iacchus, is walking in the fields. He's lamenting the fact that he's lost his population. He's lost his animals and the livestock. He's lost his fields, which have been destroyed. And as he's walking, he sees an oak tree. And on the oak tree, he sees a line of thousands and thousands of ants going up and down the oak tree. And it's at this point that he cries out and he says, "Oh, highest Father, give me as many citizens as this." This is some kind of like prayer that he's saying. And as he's saying these words, the oak tree kind of shakes a little bit, and the king walks away. And, that night he has a dream. And in this dream, he dreams that the shaking of that oak tree shook the ants off, and the ants basically emerged as human beings. This is his dream. He wakes up and he finds out that this is true. So on this account of what has happened is that he's greeted by new subjects. And while the sort of ant origin of a particular group of people is something quite old, and goes back to Hesiod and his classic story in Greek mythology, Ovid is the first writer to situate it in the context of the plague. And this is significant and instructive for us in a number of ways. So one interpretation of this is that, similar to the second account that we looked at with the bees, this is another sort of saying, okay, this is like an army, like, insects are like industrious creatures, and, they toe the line and they do what they're told. I disagree with this interpretation. To me, it's an interpretation which we have to interpret it rather in the context of Ovid's work, which is all about, metamorphosis and transformation. So in the context of his work, all different things in creation are transformed, either up or down. So they either become sort of better kind of beings or lesser ones. And it's a very rare instance of an upward transformation. Usually the human beings become animals or other objects. But here ants become human beings. And it's here that we see that Ovid is perhaps giving us an invitation that a solution to plague and war is the chance to emerge as full human beings, as people who are in touch with what it means to be human, away from the sort of technical mentality of living in the sort of modern age as worker bees or worker ants, but rather emerging as something new, as something truly human, because in many ways we have lost touch with what it means to be human. And this is obviously something very, very worrying, and being sort of out of touch with what makes us human is something that, we need to consider and take very, very seriously. So here's this invitation. So just a quick recap. On version 1, we have destruction. That's it. End of the world as we know it. It could mean in many ways, not just, the actual death of people, but the killing of the spirit of the human being. Right? A lot of people are quite miserable. in this pandemic, it is a difficult time, but it's somehow hard to find joy. It's difficult to find moments of lightness where one is truly joyful at the possibility of being alive. So that's potentially one interpretation. Version 2, well, it's a further cementing of political power. So we're talking absolutism, we're talking potentially tyranny. That's version 2 as an outcome. Version 3 is again the full emergence of the human being, and something that's hopeful, right? Something that gives us hope, because it is a time of potential renewal, and it's an opportunity for a new phase of social and moral renewal, and crucially, very crucially, this whole population, this new population that's been created from ants, is a new population. So in that way, there is a complete and definitive break with sort of old structures, old ways of doing things, even just the sort of solidification of the self. There's a complete break with that. These are people that are looking for a fresh start, for something new. There's a chance for something new to emerge. And I think this is important, because what we have seen is that many of us are questioning the way that we're living. Many of us are questioning in from sort of smaller mundane things to very big questions of, is this the healthiest, most sustainable, ideal way for us to live? Even something as simple as, it's kind of quite common for a lot of people to, live in cities, share apartments with people they don't really know, and suddenly you're stuck with them for 2 months. Is that a good idea? That's one of the questions. COVID has also obviously highlighted the extreme social, economic, and racial inequality in society. So again, how do we move forward from that? So it's a time of a lot of questioning, and it may be a time for us to really break with the things that really don't serve us, that aren't sustainable, that aren't conducive to an overall sort of living well. And on this third account, we do see this opportunity in a very expansive way, but it is contingent on us being fully human. I think that's the important thing, and that's something. What does it mean to be fully human is a question that each of us does have to determine for ourselves. We've got to get in touch with that and realize, what is it that makes us human, and to sort of move out of a sort of machine-like, robotic sort of mentality and way of living, which has affected most of us on this planet. So, in sort of just to conclude, it is that each of us really must choose which narrative we want to construct in moving forward from this quasi-plague. And these ancient writers have offered us 3 very different accounts. We may see parallels to our time. We may see, depending on our situations, which one it seems we're leaning more towards. But the idea is to find our own narrative, because ultimately the narratives that we tell ourselves and retell ourselves is a reflection and an affirmation of what we value most. And I think that is something so important and crucial for us to do in this time. So thank you very much. I'll end with that.
We thank you too much, Professor, for your contribution. I have just a question regarding the last part of your presentation. Is are we entering a new area, and from where, like we saw during these lockdowns, people, they were of course supporting the governments to put the restrictions, heavy restrictions, to not leave people into the world. So is this protectionism, or are we entering a new system, political system, with those where people are accepting these kind of new restrictions and new political order?
Because on the one hand, of course, there's a sort of moral obligation that we have to sort of make sure that the people who need the most protection are protected, right? That we know that, yes, we may not all die if we get this disease, but there are certain categories of people who are at higher risk. And the question is, and I mean, this is, we sort of take it for granted that, that is our position, that we want to protect the vulnerable. I mean, in many societies, historically, that was definitely not the way of doing things. I think, to me, the most important thing is really making the determination of moving forward as to how we conceive of things, which means that we should be quite active in the civic arena where we see things that are going too far. Where we see this looks unreasonable, we must use the tools that we have, and within our legal systems, within our political systems, to try and combat what looks like a sort of over infringement on our freedom. Yet at the same time, we also have to balance that with the management of something which is quite devastating, on not just for individuals and death and health, but obviously all the economic implications as well. And I think the thing that's really what's striking about this is that we seem to also be going in a bit of a loop in many countries. So it can start off with very strict regulations, they get easier, and then they get hard again. Is this maybe a new sort of conditioning for us? I don't know. It's difficult to say if this is now going to be the thing of, okay, so you have some freedom and then not. But certainly it is a very confronting and challenging time as far as sort of regulations and freedoms are concerned.
Yes, thank you. And the other question would be, when it comes to the leaders of maybe the most powerful countries, do we have any kind of similarities between the past and the present? Like the leaders of the past, their attitudes towards plagues, and today's leader towards their attitudes towards COVID-19 pandemic?
That's a great question. So I think, to me, ultimately, one of the things that we see time and time again in history is that really it is about people who are able to read the moment and take the opportunities, for better or for worse. Right? I mean, there is a moment where, which in whatever sort of political situation you find yourself in, leaders can absolutely take advantage of what's going on to further augment or cement their power. At the same time, it can also be the case that it's the catalyst for a lot of change, that suddenly people who are quite sort of apolitical and kind of, I don't really care, are suddenly like, no, we need to get these people out, or we need new people in. There certainly are similarities in the tactics, for sure. And I think to some degree, we can see similarities as well in the sort of civil discord that's going on, that there's been unrest in a number of countries, most prominently the United States over this past summer. And that has been, it's very clear. To me, I would think, of course, COVID has played a big role in that, in these kinds of confrontations.
Thank you very much, Professor. I'm just looking for what maybe we have any kind of questions. It was really nice to be with you in this online program studio. So it was insightful, very informative, and really thank you for your contribution. Of course, I want to ask another question. Just the third one is coming from one of the who is currently watching the program. The last question will be, what kind of outcomes we will have at the end of the pandemic regarding psychological and political? Like, what are the outcome of this pandemic?
Well, I think, to me, one of the first things that we have to be aware of is that we don't know when the end to this will be. That's one of the puzzling and difficult things about COVID in particular, because it just seems that, we may be going on, and this may be, for years and years. I think, to me, one of the big psychological effects is that we are really at risk of losing a lot of connections with people. At every level, obviously, if we're under regulation, we can't actually see people, but all of our interactions seemingly are happening in a virtual online space. And while, of course, that has its advantages, and it's great that we can still continue with our work and studying and all of that, the effect is that we are losing something very key to being human, in losing that kind of interaction. Of course, the other aspects, and I think it really is quite fascinating that the ancient writers could also see this, is this idea of, I think, mainly fear. right? That fear is a huge thing, and that psychologically we are stepping into a realm of being very paranoid, being very fearful. And some other outcomes of that may then be the sort of, hedonistic kind of lifestyle, in a different way. But I think, to me, the fear and paranoia is something that we, do need to sort of keep in check, because there's nothing that, fear, paranoia, it paralyzes you. It absolutely paralyzes you and makes you unable to act. And that absolutely then feeds into a sort of political outcome, because if you have a citizenry who is sort of just hanging back and fearful and I don't want to even get involved, that's very bad news. That's very bad news for any kind of governance structure. We need to continue questioning, acting, and looking towards what the best decisions for us will be.
So thank you, Professor. Thank you very much for your time and your contribution. It was really my pleasure to have you here, and looking forward to see you in another program next future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for all, and see you in the next program.
Hopefully I can fly to Istanbul.
Hopefully, we will be waiting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a nice night.